This is Rudayna Abdo with Urban Nibbles. My guest today is Maysa Sabah, who is a Senior Associate Planner and Housing Specialist with AECOM's UAE office. Welcome, Maysa.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. And I think we're going to be addressing a very interesting topic, which to me very much highlights a lot of what has been exposed with COVID and a lot of the inequalities that have that emerged. In my particular work, most recently now, I'm working in the education and refugee arena, and we're seeing this digital divide pushing marginalized communities further. Can you please give us some highlights on what the pandemic has done, or the impacts of it on low-income residents and those in marginalized communities?
So we are often, when we talk about the relationship between poor quality housing and health, we usually talk about living in damp housing, living in substandard units in terms of heating, units that don't have enough ventilation or exposure to light, living with lead paint, living in neighborhoods with deteriorated infrastructure, open sewage, all of these things. So this has been kind of traditionally how, at least I think about the link between poor housing and health, because all these situations can expose you to health risks. But I think what has been happening recently with this pandemic has taken this link between poor housing and health to a whole new level. And the global response to this pandemic of staying at home, keeping social distance and washing your hands does not work for low-income people and those living in informal communities. So if you are homeless, then you don't have a home to be locked in. If you are a low-income household, then staying at home means hunger. If you live in overcrowded accommodations, then social distancing becomes very difficult. And there are some mind-boggling statistics from UNICEF, for example. 40%, imagine 40% of the world's population, that's about like 3 billion people, do not have a hand washing facility with soap and water in their homes. So hand washing is very difficult. And of course, living in poor conditions and during lockdown must have a negative impact on mental health. So if all of these things aren't a wake-up call for stakeholders to really address shortages in adequate housing for low-income households and those living in informal settlements, then it's really difficult to think about what will be a wake-up call. Now, on a more slightly positive note, here in the Arab region, many governments have been had launched slum improvement programs, whether it's upgrading informal settlements directly on site or rehousing dwellers of informal settlements, with notable examples from Morocco, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So hopefully, because of these improved housing conditions, at least in some communities in this region of ours, this has softened the blow on low-income households.
Well, with economic crisis, that's going to only get worse and worse globally, and in the Arab region everywhere, no doubt. What's that going to do to homelessness, do you think? And with the pandemic and the impacts pre-vaccine, post-vaccine, and the spread or controlling the spread, any ideas of how homelessness and what policies would be to address homelessness, how that's going to be handled?
I mean, homelessness right now during the pandemic, we have seen in some cases homeless people being fined and evicted, and in other cases we have seen governments taking action to address homelessness. So with whether it's expanding existing shelters to allow for social distancing, whether it's creating new shelters, whether it's even taking some, installing like hand washing facilities and toilets in areas where there is concentration of homeless populations, and whether it's also like homeless preventive measures such as freezes on evictions, freezes on utility shutdowns because of non-payment, rent relief, mortgage relief. So, but again, the question is, why did it have to take a pandemic for some governments in the world to address homelessness? So obviously, when there is political will, there is a political way. And these are all emergency responses and not necessarily long-term solutions. Now, to address homelessness over the long run, again, we need to go back and look at the issue of affordable housing more holistically. And now with this pandemic, so all the interventions that we want to do in terms of affordable housing and housing for middle and low income households now will also take health consequences into consideration. So that will, hopefully be amplified. So, and if you want, we can talk about what those could be.
Definitely, yeah, I would love that. And it's a wake-up call on so many fronts. It's a wake-up call on how we govern, what our policies are, how we build. And I'm thinking with the how we build and the strict land use designations that we've built for, and the inflexibility for which we've built for. Some sectors are in huge decline. Who knows when they'll be revived, with the travel industry, entertainment industry. So how is the hotel industry going to be occupied? What are the occupancies are going to be there? And is this an opportunity now for housing those who don't have appropriate shelter? Are you seeing any discourse around that in changes of uses that were originally intended for one use and being converted to others? And again, I would also actually talk about office space. I think we're going to be seeing we're all doing the remote work setup now, and businesses are going to be seriously reconsidering how much they continue investing in the real estate for office space. Do you think this is an opportunity? Have you seen governments or any discourse about this, about the flexibility and the changes of land uses?
So I think regardless of the impact of this pandemic on the future demand for office space, this boardroom to bedroom trend has been going on for a while. But we need to keep a few things in mind when we think about the potential impact of this conversion on housing. So one thing is many office developers will probably be reluctant to convert their buildings into residential use because office space may have higher returns than residential use, especially middle and low income housing, unless you have a government subsidy to bridge that gap. And also the office vacancies may be scattered in different buildings and not necessarily one full building that is vacant. And so as a result, retrofitting would be more complicated if you're just, you want to change only some of the building and not a whole building. So that complicates the situation. The location of the office building is also important. So perhaps office buildings that are located in residential areas are more easily convertible to residential units than otherwise. And also the age of the building. So older buildings that are due for a renovation anyway can be more easily converted. So given all of these factors, maybe we don't want to over kind of emphasize this as this conversion from office to residential having a huge impact or really significant impact on the supply of middle income housing. It may or it may not, depending on the situation. But it's, yeah.
Okay, interesting. And I hope that this is a point of reflection and change on the policy side of how we've always done things, and this is an opportunity for governments to introduce policies and enabling methods, whether they're how the tax systems are based. I just hope that this will be a point of opportunity rather than building new stock and having vacancies in another stock. There's so much embedded energy that goes into creating these, and then that may also help push the mixing of land uses more, or the mixing of uses, so that we have these more complete communities that are developing and move away from office park development and conversions. So I think, yeah, on the policy side, actually, can you think of, as far as things that affordable housing aspects of change that we're ripe for, that this is a ripe opportunity, a prime opportunity to consider things on the policy side to address?
Yeah, I mean, there are, obviously this is a very big question, and the answer depends on, it's very context specific, depending on, political conditions, environmental conditions, socioeconomic conditions, etc. But at the same time, there are some best practices that we have seen that have made an impact in many parts of the world. So, but in general, all policy interventions can happen at different stages of development and of financing, and can have an impact on middle and low income housing. So, for example, in pre-development, increasing densities in urban locations. I know density has been kind of a controversial issue now, but from what I've seen and read, it's more about the density within the unit, because it has like this close interaction with other people more than the density at the scale level, because that has many advantages, especially in terms of emergency response. Inclusionary zoning, which is mandating certain middle and low income housing percentages in all developments. During the development stage, lowering costs, reducing the cost of development through subsidizing land, labor, material, allowing flexibility in land use, density bonuses, streamlining processes, whether it's in financing, looking at microfinance or impact investing, subsidizing grants and mortgages, in designing efficient and smaller units, but that are well ventilated and well lit and that have balconies. So making sure that standards look at also these very important health considerations, and also post-occupancy, whether it's protecting property rights and looking at new forms of tenure beyond this binary rent or buy. So looking at shared ownership that is based on community land trusts and cooperatives. So these are things that we have been talking about for years, and we've seen examples. But to me, what is more interesting and what is kind of breathing new life into this discussion of middle income housing is technology and what technology can do. Now, but many of these technological interventions that relate to housing are still, in many cases, kind of too sophisticated and still very expensive to apply in different contexts. But there is hope that as the technology evolve, it will become cheaper and more accessible. So examples of those are like dynamic zoning, which responds to the needs of communities, including the need for middle and low income housing, based on real-time data instead of these static zoning codes that we currently have in place. Building information modeling to make building housing more quickly and more improve collaboration and more efficiently. Modular construction, again, to build more efficiently and more quickly and lower costs, especially if it's done at a scale. Robotic interiors and smart furniture. I know you've seen also those examples that make that change the use of units more quickly, taking into consideration ventilation and the air circulation and light in units. Blockchain powered and protected shared ownership, which protects tenure.
Can you talk a bit more about that? Blockchain power?
I was reading about that, and I was telling my husband, I was reading about an example I think it was in Brazil. There's a company in the UK that they did so many things, but one of the examples that they did, I think it was in an informal settlement in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. They used, they put like these tiles underneath a like a football stadium, a small stadium in an informal settlement. So they put these tiles that use kinetic energy. So the more, as children run around and play football, they create this energy that lights up the stadium. I mean, this is a non-housing related example, but I find it like so amazing to have these kind of innovations in microgrids based on renewable energy that can provide power in formal settlements. And of course, there are experiments with housing units, like building one unit that through the material that is used, through solar power, through different things, it can generate and preserve power. So there are lots of experiments in housing and outside housing that are very exciting, not only making housing in an informal settlement more efficient, but the whole settlement, improving the quality of life. But what I also want to say is all these, all these interventions, all these tools, all these policies, all these technological innovations, they will remain a band-aid if they are not backed by strong, powerful, committed leadership that is very serious and almost aggressive about addressing middle and low income housing, whether it's through directly intervening in social development, I mean directly or indirectly, but very strongly intervening in social development, whether it's through protecting or limiting increases in rents, and we have seen some of this here in Dubai, or curbing speculation. So without like this very strong leadership with a comprehensive vision of how to address the shortage of middle and low income housing, all these different interventions will remain just isolated solutions.
You mentioned Dubai, the UAE doing a good response. Can you think of other examples, maybe with more strained economies, that have done a very good job as a pandemic response, and that could have lasting, enduring effects that other nations can learn from, other settlements can learn from?
I think, again, going back to I mean, in terms of housing, I think the cities that have done well in terms of protecting housing for middle and low income households during this pandemic are the cities that had strong systems anyway in place, and they were doing a good job of protecting middle and low income housing before the pandemic. This is generally. So there are many examples of these cities that have done that. And of course, no city and no system is perfect, but for the most part, they have addressed the issue of there are models to look into. So again, for example, in Vienna, in Europe, where the government owns most of the land and is very active in developing municipal housing for residents, in Copenhagen, where housing cooperatives are a very common model, and it's a model of shared ownership. Singapore, where the government owns most of the land and is very involved in developing and managing housing for most of the population. Now, again, because I'm based in this region, I like to show and look at examples from this region. So we have seen some noteworthy examples of interventions from governments to protect housing during the pandemic. So, for example, here in Dubai, utility bills were decreased during the pandemic. UAE companies by law must continue to pay their staff housing allowances even if they are made redundant. We've seen also many governments defer mortgage payments, including the UAE, Jordan, Kuwait, Tunisia, and Egypt. So, so these are some of the the interventions that we have seen on the housing front.
You just mentioned a couple, the example of the UAE, how they in the region, how they've done some great responses for the short term. Moving forward, as we post-pandemic, moving with new systems, hopefully, are there things that are worthy to carry forward that we should hold on to that may be threatened as far as policy or practice with dealing with housing? And I'm particularly interested in the low-income part of housing that we should carry forward. And then the flip to that would be, what should we definitely leave behind that is more likely, that could be dragged forward? So how could we rethink our practices? I know you've talked a lot about these things, but do you have any highlights, any favorites you'd like to share?
I mean, I think if I want to be specific, for sure, this to me, this cannot but be a wake-up call for everybody to raise housing standards, to put standards in place that improve health and well-being within the unit in different parts of the world, and I mean, we now see it's a very clear example of what happens when you have in many cities informal settlements and overcrowding and poor housing conditions. Housing is a public health issue. This is very obvious now for anybody who was skeptical or was not aware. So I hope that this kind of shock and realization that we don't forget about it after post-pandemic, and that we keep it, we build on it, and to improve housing conditions for all, for sure. But I think I think even more generally, as urban designers, as urban planners, we, I hope we absorb and absorb the importance of what we do when we design, when we put in place policies, standards, guidelines, codes. Design cities, transportation systems, open spaces, sustainability, community facilities, all these things, they really have an impact on economies, on the livelihoods of people, on their health, on their well-being, on their quality of life, on their happiness. So I really hope that as a profession, we take ourselves more seriously and kind of step up to this responsibility. This is something I think it's important. Leave behind, I think, despair. There's so much, especially again in the Arab world, there's so much grief, despair, misery all around us. But I think always in the messiness of life, there is hope. So, and we need to, hold on to that hope and build on it as humans, as human beings, and as professionals to improve the quality of life in our city.
Well, I love ending on a hopeful note, and another conversation that we didn't touch upon that maybe I'll have in the future is the refugee and migrant community scenario, but we won't touch that today, and we will end on a hopeful note, because I agree with you. I think there is so much despair, there's so much opportunity to change things, and this is such a wake-up call on so many fronts. Housing is part of this whole mix, and thank you very much for your insights and this rich conversation. And
thank you, Rodina.
Great to see you here, and looking forward to continuing the dialogue.
Yes, looking forward to it too.
Take care.